Currently, most of us are on a temporary layoff. We are now receiving signals that economies are going to have a soft start. We're hearing about Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island as examples. But we call this stage 4 of our 5 stages. And this is where it becomes the most difficult and challenging part of what has to be done next. The economy is reopening, but the marketplace is it going to be as we had seen it before? I think most people would argue, no, not necessarily. Which industries are going to be opening first? Which will be allowed to operate first? What are the restrictions that will be imposed on them? And with that, what is your organization going to look like? What will it resemble as to what you used to have prior to COVID-19? This is a dollars and cents issue. So in as much as we like to talk about FTEs, full-time equivalents, that really is an accounting term that has nothing to do with HR per se, employees. You're going to have 100 FTEs, and that could in fact be 500 employees if they're working 1 day a week. We have to take a look at each particular employee and what the impact will be on that individual, because each one of those people is potentially a challenge for you as an employer. Now, we've covered off some health and safety issues for you in the last URL in terms of some thoughts that you might want to be considering as you bring people back into the workplace. Now we're actually going to be talking about, well, what is it going to look like? We have direct labor costs, indirect labor costs, we have fixed costs, we have variable costs. At this moment in time, just based upon what we've already seen as evidence when we were all laid off, everything in effect became variable. And that is in fact our starting point going forward as we look to reopen our businesses. But with that, there's some very, very serious payroll costs as well as legal costs that potentially are at risk if it is not done properly. And we can't lose sight of the fact that payroll as an expense item is really, for the most part, the largest cost center in any organization. So let's start with the first point, the permanent layoff. We've already had conversations with clients with regards to converting a temporary layoff to a permanent layoff as early as this week. Bottom line is you will likely not have to fill all positions when you are about to get your business underway again. And with that in mind, you're going to be having to consider permanent layoffs. So the most important part to remember is you will, in Canada, have to give formal, proper notice in terms of laying somebody off, in effect terminating them. You'll have to take a look at any employment contracts you have as it relates to any individuals. We will absolutely look at the minimum standards for every province to ensure that you are going to be meeting those as a minimum requirement. And then you are also going to consider, particularly for senior positions, whether in fact you might want to sweeten the pie a little bit in order to thwart an action for wrongful dismissal. And under those circumstances, you should recognize that you might want to get a release signed so that you don't encounter further liabilities. Another consideration is bringing people back. Now, a recall really is subject to much interpretation, but certainly from my experience, a recall is returning back to the job that I had at the time that I left. In other words, you're not changing anything in my terms and conditions of employment. So the real goal in a recall process is to follow whatever your regimen is that you have followed as a general rule with your workforce. So as an example, some non-union organizations actually follow the principle of seniority as it relates to scheduling, even though there's no legal obligation to do that. That's essentially a unionized workforce terminology that we talk about. But if it's a common practice, then one would think that that similar common practice is going to be followed for returning people to the workplace, not thinking necessarily in terms of performance. So one's going to have to be guided by what you want to be doing in terms of how you bring people back. I know that the preferred route will always be, I want my best people back and I'll get rid of my worst people. And that may be the right answer, but you might want to take a look at it through the lens of how you have, in fact, engaged in employee relations up until the time of the COVID-19 layoffs. Under a collective agreement, it's fairly straightforward. It's normally defined contractually. Here are the terms how you lay people off. Here are the terms how you recall them. If they don't come back to work, then they are deemed to be terminated. But it is an expectation that people are returning to their normal duties. So even under a collective agreement, a full-time employee required to come back at to a part-time job may not necessarily be a recall as it relates to that particular collective agreement. And of course, the most important part is in terms of the employment relationship that you had leaving, i.e. going into the layoff, and then returning the person, that if you are going to consider changing the terms and conditions of employment, then of course you want to make sure that you give them a reasonable period of notice. But the whole idea of a recall, for the most part, is returning a person to the position that they had at the time that they left. Another consideration I've spoken with clients about is modifying job descriptions. So our revenues are going to be down, therefore the amount of expense that we can afford is also going to be down. So our requirements are not going to be as great, and we may discover that we can actually operate two departments under the helm of one manager, where in the past we might have had two managers, one for each department. That in turn may result in some pressures from that employee, expecting that they be compensated more. And of course, you have to contemplate then the cost of that manager that you're not returning, and in fact, that will be considered a permanent layoff, and it will produce whatever your termination costs might be. The other matter that you will be thinking about is as it relates to internal equity. And that is, as you make changes in one person's position, their job, it may impact on what the value is of another job. And that should be taken into consideration as the new model is constructed. The other consideration, of course, is ongoing temporary layoff. And that particular idea is, I'm sure, going to continue. For the most part across Canada, you're looking at around 13 weeks in terms of how long the temporary layoff could continue for. In Ontario and Quebec, it's a little bit different. In Ontario, you can actually, if you wish, buy up to 35 weeks of temporary layoff, and indeed many organizations have done precisely that. So I would also say to you that the most important part in this conversation is that you indeed are going to have to consider costs associated with temporary layoff very, very shortly, probably during the month of May, where you will have to make decisions in terms of recalling employees or permanently laying them off. We've talked repeatedly about constructive dismissal. I'm sure you are all more than aware of it now. And that essentially is, again, where there's a unilateral change in terms and conditions of employment by an employer that is to the detriment of employee in the absence of giving proper notice or where it might violate an employment contract. So, I mean, here are some thoughts that you might want to consider in terms of what constitutes constructive dismissal. These are some ideas: reduction in salary and benefits, where an individual has to assume more responsibility without consideration, i.e. they take on another person's job, so they're doing double duty for the same amount of pay, moving from full-time to part-time, not wanting to do that. Reporting structure, where all of a sudden the person was reporting to a vice president, now report to a director who reports to a vice president, and it could also be even a change in title. Any of these items could potentially trigger a constructive dismissal argument. As an employer, you've got obviously some defenses there. There's mitigation issues that an employee has to consider. But for the most part, if you are going to do any of these things, you might want to consider providing a reasonable period of notice for that kind of a change. I'm throwing in this idea of vacations into this conversation because the one common thread through all of these is the cost associated with employees. And what I've discovered is that the vacation issue has been really quite a significant subject matter. In some cases, people were trying to force people on vacation rather than laying them off. in order to deplete the vacation bank. Now, a couple of things. The idea of vacation can be described in a couple of ways. The one common theme, it's an earned benefit. So that is for sure the case. But how it's manifested actually may be different. So it could be based upon a percentage of income. And normally it's over a 12-month period. So I've worked for 12 months. I get 4% of my income as vacation pay. 4% equals 2 weeks of vacation to be taken in the following year. Other organizations say, well, no, you earn it at a rate of 5/6 of a day a month, which is the 4%, or 3 weeks, which is 6%. And that would be, I'm accruing at the rate of a day and a half, or a day and a quarter, I'm sorry. That day and a quarter is in fact going to be earned for every month of service that I have. And that's exactly what I expect to be receiving. I've not talked about percentages of previous year's earnings whatsoever. I'm just entitled to a day and a quarter. And as you can see at the bottom here, I've cited an example where the 2 months that we're talking about for the months of April and May just illustrate the point. If it's on a percentage basis, because the individual has no earnings, therefore $0, you still have an obligation to give them 2.5 days of time off. It's unpaid though. Whereas the other one, which I was describing, which is a day and a quarter per month, actually converts into 2.5 days with pay that is owed to that person for the 2 months that they have not been working. So it really is an opportunity for you to take a look at what your liability is and how you have actually fashioned your vacation policy. Again, this is another cost item that you're having to address, especially with the pressures of cash flow. Another potential problem area is where, in fact, there is bargaining in a work and non-bargaining work that could easily blend together. And this is customarily at the front line jobs, if you wish, frontline supervision, where a supervisor may indeed do some of the work of, in fact, what a unionized employee might be doing. When you do this, there is clearly the risk of bargaining work being performed by non-bargaining personnel that can produce a grievance. Or there's the alternative, you're in a non-union environment and the employees who otherwise would think they should be doing that work have their boss doing that work, and they say that's not fair, and as a result of that, they actually might go and submit to having a union come to represent them. So I'm going to take you back to our first presentation and just some extracts from that. Prepare your plan for each individual employee. Consider some of the points that I've made. Always ask yourself, when I decide about this employee, how will my decision be perceived by other employees? Now, a workplace is not a democracy, so let me be clear, I don't believe that. But I do believe that an employer is being tested every time that a decision is made around an employee. You know, one can only think of the examples where the employer wants to give a salary adjustment to one particular employee, and they say, wink, wink, this is confidential, don't share this with anybody. And how long does it take before, indeed, everybody knows that this person got a preferred status? So a thoughtful restart of your business will garner the best results, and hopefully that you can actually seize opportunities in this very uncertain marketplace. So again, your payroll costs are, for the most part, your largest cost center. They have got all sorts of potential consequences in terms of when the decisions are being made. But I really encourage you to think about each individual and your conduct as it relates to what you're going to be doing with that person, beyond just simply what is the macro perspective, which is what is my total payroll load that I'm having to consider. Thank you.